You can tell a lot about a man by the way he steals a place he never built. That was the first thought that hit me when I turned off County Road 14 just after sunrise and saw something glittering across my gravel drive. At first I thought it was dew catching the light. Then my truck rolled another 6 feet, and I saw the metal spikes laid low across the entrance like somebody had decided my family's cabin needed a warning label. I stopped so hard my coffee sloshed over the rim and onto my jeans, and for a second all I could hear was the engine ticking, the wind moving through the pine trees, and that dry little crunch of gravel settling under my tires. My name is Ethan Walker, and that cabin at the end of the drive had been in my family longer than most of the houses in that HOA had even existed. My father built the back deck himself with cedar planks he hauled in on a borrowed trailer. My mother picked the green paint for the shutters because she said it matched the water out on the lake at dusk. Every summer, that place smelled like sun-warmed wood, old coffee, boat rope, and the faint gasoline tang from the little outboard motor we kept under a canvas cover. It was not just real estate. It was the one place in the world that still felt like my last name meant something. So when I looked up from those spike strips and saw my cabin door painted black, my brass lock missing, and a new sign posted beside the porch steps like somebody had staged a cheap takeover overnight, I felt something go cold inside me. Not hot. Cold. The kind of cold that makes everything sharper. Then I saw him. Grant Holloway, my HOA neighbor from 3 lots over. He was standing on my porch in a pressed pullover, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a ceramic mug I knew for a fact had come from my kitchen cabinet because it had a chipped handle my father glued back together 10 years ago. He took a sip like he had all the time in the world, looked down at me, and gave me this little smile that told me he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Morning, Ethan," he called out. Like we were discussing whether instead of the fact that he was standing on my property. "You can't park there anymore. This cabin's been annexed into the HOA improvement zone." I actually stared at him for a second because the sentence was so stupid it didn't land all at once. Annexed. Improvement zone. My family cabin, sitting on its own surveyed parcel with its own deed, its own tax record, and its own legal access easement. And this man said it like a board meeting had somehow erased 40 years of ownership. I stepped out of the truck and smelled fresh paint before I even reached the mailbox. Black paint on the door. Chemical and sharp. Still tacky in the morning air. My pulse started thudding in my ears, but I kept walking slow enough to see what he hoped I wouldn't notice. The spikes weren't random. They were bolted across my legal easement. My road. My access. And right then, before I said another word, before I even looked back up at Grant Holloway, I knew something he didn't. He thought he'd locked me out. What he'd really done was hand me the one mistake that would get him thrown out in less than 48 hours. Grant came down the porch steps like he was doing me a favor, careful with his loafers on the damp wood, still holding that chipped mug in one hand like he had earned the right to touch anything inside that cabin. Up close, he smelled like expensive cologne and fresh laundry detergent, the kind of clean scent people wear when they want to look respectable while doing something ugly. He stopped a few feet from the spike strips and pointed at them with the casual pride of a man showing off new landscaping. "Had to put those in after some concerns from the board," he said. "We cannot have unauthorized vehicles tearing up community access." I looked past him at the drive, at the same pale gravel my father spread with a borrowed tractor when I was 12, and for a second I saw the old version of the place layered over the one standing in front of me now. I saw my mother on the porch railing with a towel over her shoulder. I heard the screen door slap shut behind my father as he carried a tackle box out to the dock. I remembered the pencil marks on the inside pantry wall where he measured my height every summer until I turned 16 and stopped pretending I had outgrown this place. Grant kept talking, but his voice had started sounding far away, like it was blowing in from another property. Because this was not some extra lot beside a clubhouse. This was the cabin where my father taught me how to change a trailer tire, where my mother burned pancakes every 4th of July, because she was always distracted watching the lake, where the brass hook by the back door still had a groove worn into the wood from 40 years of keys hanging in the same spot. "You abandoned it," Grant said, and that pulled me back fast. He said it with a little shrug, like the words settled everything. The place sat quiet for months. The association had to step in. We cleaned it up, secured it, and folded it into the development plan. I stared at him. Abandoned. That word landed even harder than annexed. I had not abandoned anything. I had been in Columbus closing out my father's estate, sorting hospital bills, probate forms, and the kind of paperwork that turns grief into stacks. I had been driving down every other weekend, checking the place, winterizing the pipes, paying the taxes early, keeping the dock permit current, making sure nothing slipped, because my father was the kind of man who kept every receipt in a labeled envelope, and I could not stand the thought of letting his place fall into disorder. The cabin was never neglected. It was waiting. There is a difference, and men like Grant always pretend there is not. He nodded toward the black-painted door like he expected me to admire the upgrade. We improved the appearance. It fits the neighborhood now. Improved. I could still smell the paint from where I stood, sharp and synthetic, covering the old green my mother chose the year I turned 9. My jaw tightened so hard I could feel it behind my ears. Then I noticed something else. My old tackle bench was gone from under the side window. The red gas can that always sat beside the shed was missing. Even the welcome mat had been replaced with one of those stamped coir mats that said Lake Life in fake cheerful letters. Little things. Stupid things. But every one of them was a fingerprint. Every one of them proved he had crossed from arrogance into possession. Grant lifted the mug again and gave me that same thin smile. I would save yourself the trouble and just call the board office. I looked at the cabin, at the replaced lock, at the painted door, at the strips bolted over my easement, and I felt that cold focus settle deeper. He thought I was going to argue. He thought I was going to stand there on the gravel and raise my voice and give him the kind of scene men like him know how to twist. Instead, I reached into my truck, pulled out my phone, and took my first picture. The camera clicks sounded louder than it should have in the morning quiet. One photo of the spike strips. One of the new black paint on the door. One of the posted sign. One of Grant Holloway standing on my porch with my family mug in his hand, and that practiced look on his face, like he had already rehearsed how this story would sound when he told it to other people. He gave a short laugh under his breath when he saw me taking pictures. Go ahead, he said. Documentation helps everybody. That was the first honest thing he had said all morning, even if he did not realize it. I kept my phone steady and moved slowly, letting each image lock into focus. The bolts through the metal strips. The fresh drill shavings still scattered in the gravel. The edge of the signpost set crooked because whoever installed it had been in a hurry. Details matter when somebody thinks confidence can replace ownership. Grant leaned one shoulder against the porch post and watched me with the relaxed expression of a man who believed paper language and neighborhood status could bend reality. The board already reviewed this, he said. There is a transition file, compliance letters, improvement authorization. Everything is handled. I did not answer right away. I zoomed in on the mug instead. White ceramic, blue stripe near the rim, small chip on the handle where the glue line ran darker than the rest. My father dropped that mug on the stone hearth one November morning and spent 20 minutes fixing it because he hated throwing away useful things. Seeing it in Grant's hand did something strange to me. It made the whole scene smaller and uglier at the same time. Not a grand legal dispute. Not some complicated misunderstanding. Just a man so sure nobody would stop him that he had walked into my cabin, opened my cabinet, and chosen a cup for his coffee. You went inside? I said. Grant lifted his eyebrows. Of course I went inside. We had to secure the structure. Structure. That word sat there between us like a stain. To him, it was a structure. To me, it was the smell of cedar after rain, the soft groan the dock made in late summer, the window over the sink where my mother used to watch storms move across the lake. I started taking video next. I panned from the drive to the porch to Grant and back again, capturing the full approach from the county road, the posted notice, the strips across the easement, the changed lock, the painted door. He shifted a little when he realized I was no longer just snapping angry pictures. I was building a timeline. You are making this harder than it has to be, he said. You have been away a long time, Ethan. The neighborhood changed. I stopped the video and looked at him for the first time in a way that made him straighten. The neighborhood can change all at once, I said. County records do not. His smile thinned after that. Not gone, but tighter. I could see the first flicker of irritation behind the polished HOA voice. Good. Irritation makes people sloppy. I stepped back toward my truck, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out the folder I kept for the cabin. Insurance cards. Tax receipts. Utility statements. Enough to prove a pattern, not enough to finish the fight. Grant saw the folder and gave me that same dismissive shrug. None of that overrides board action. There it was again. Board action. Like the board was a higher court, a private kingdom with decorative shrubs and a newsletter. I almost laughed. Instead, I looked past him at the side window, where I noticed another thing missing. The old weathered wooden bench my father used for fishing gear was gone, and in its place sat a square plastic storage box from some home improvement store, bright and cheap and completely wrong for that cabin. That was when I understood what Grant had really done. He had not just locked me out. He had started replacing the place piece by piece, swapping history for uniformity, memory for approved aesthetics. And men who do that always leave a trail. Receipts, messages, orders, witnesses. I slid the folder under my arm, took one more photo of the bolts in those spike strips, and said the only thing I needed to say. Do not touch another thing. Grant smiled again, but this time it looked forced around the edges. Or what? I looked at the strips, at the gravel drive my father laid by hand, at the black paint drying over my mother's green, and then back at him. Or you are going to find out the difference between running an association and trespassing on a deeded property. Then I got in my truck, backed out carefully, and drove straight toward the county office with the windows down, the pine air sharp in my lungs, and the smell of fresh paint still clinging to my clothes like a challenge. By the time I reached the county records office, the coffee stain on my jeans had dried stiff and the morning fog had burned off the lake. The courthouse annex sat 3 miles from the marina, a square brick building with humming fluorescent lights, scuffed tile floors, and that dry paper smell every county office seems to have, like dust, toner, and old decisions. I signed in, gave the clerk the parcel number from memory, and watched her type with the slow patience of someone who had seen every version of neighbor drama a lakeside county could produce. When she looked back up at me, her expression changed just enough to matter. This parcel is still individually deeded, she said. No transfer, no merger, no annexation filing. I felt that cold focus settle deeper in my chest. Can you print everything tied to it? I asked, including access easements and survey attachments. She nodded and disappeared into the back while I stood there listening to the whir of an old printer and the faint buzz from a soda machine down the hall. 10 minutes later, she handed me a stack thick enough to make the truth feel physical. Warranty deed, tax map, survey plat, access easement recorded 22 years ago. No amendment, no board authority, no transfer of title, no development overlay touching. My lot. I thanked her, stepped aside to a metal folding table, and spread the pages out in order. There it was in black ink and county stamp, cleaner than I even hoped. My cabin sat outside the association boundary by a clean margin, and the gravel lane Grant had blocked was not community access. It was my legal easement, expressly preserved, with maintenance language so clear a middle schooler could understand it. I took pictures of every page and emailed copies to myself. Then to a local real estate attorney my father used once during a dock line dispute 15 years earlier. Her name was Claire Donnelly. I still had her card tucked in the back sleeve of my folder because my father believed good surveyors, good mechanics, and good lawyers were worth keeping forever. She called me before I even made it back to the truck. Ethan, she said, voice calm and crisp, tell me you did not move those spike strips yourself. I did not touch them, I said. Good, she answered. That makes this simpler. Simpler was not the same thing as easy, and by noon I was learning the difference. Claire told me to preserve everything. Not escalate, not force entry, and not give Grant a single dramatic scene he could try to recast as harassment. Then she told me something better. If he blocked a deeded easement and changed locks on a separately owned structure without legal authority, he is not standing in some gray area. He is standing in your paperwork. I drove from her office straight to the sheriff's substation with copies clipped in order, each page labeled with a sticky note. The deputy at the front counter was polite, professional, and exactly as cautious as the situation required. He reviewed the documents, compared parcel numbers, and made a few calls while I stood there under an air vent that smelled faintly like dust and lemon cleaner. When he came back, he did not give me the instant when Grant would have mocked me for expecting. He said because Grant was physically occupying the property and claiming authority under a private dispute, they would need to verify and proceed carefully. Civil side first. No immediate removal without field confirmation. It was not the answer I wanted. It was the answer I got. I walked back outside into the bright afternoon sun with a folder full of proof and the irritating weight of delay pressing behind my ribs. For one ugly minute, I sat in my truck and stared through the windshield at the courthouse flag snapping in the wind, and wondered if Grant understood exactly how these systems slowed down just enough for men like him to feel safe. Then my phone buzzed. A photo alert from the trail camera I had forgotten was still mounted in the pine tree near the side shed. I opened it, and there on my screen was Grant, carrying a plastic storage tote out of my cabin like he was shopping in someone else's memory. That was when the day shifted. Because paperwork was one thing, time-stamped evidence was another, and suddenly 48 hours did not feel optimistic anymore. It felt precise. The trail camera image hit harder than any argument Grant had made all day. There he was in the washed-out afternoon light, carrying one of my clear plastic storage totes out the side door with both hands, head tilted down, moving with the comfortable rhythm of a man who had already decided none of this would come back on him. The timestamp in the corner glowed like a witness that did not get tired, did not forget, and did not care how polished his HOA voice sounded on a porch. I pulled over under a row of sycamores across from the marina, turned the air conditioning up, and scrolled through every new image the camera had captured. Grant going in, Grant coming out, Grant dragging the cheap plastic deck box closer to the wall under the side window, Grant pausing near the shed with his phone pressed to his ear, smiling like he was discussing landscaping instead of my property. In one frame, I could even see the edge of my father's old tackle bench behind him, pushed halfway out of view like he was trying to erase the place one object at a time. I sent the images straight to Claire. She called me back in under 5 minutes. Now we have movement of personal property after notice, she said. That matters. A lot. Her voice stayed steady, but I could hear the sharpened edge underneath it, the part lawyers get when the facts stop being messy and start becoming useful. She told me to come to her office immediately. By the time I got there, the afternoon heat was laying over town like a warm sheet, and my shirt had stuck to my back from climbing in and out of the truck all day. Claire's office sat above a pharmacy on Main Street. 2 rooms with old oak shelves, framed survey maps, and a window unit that rattled every few minutes like it was clearing its throat. She already had my deed packet spread across her desk when I walked in, along with printed copies of the trail camera shots and a yellow legal pad covered in neat, slanted handwriting. He made a mistake this morning, she said, tapping the easement language with one pen, and he made another one this afternoon. I sat down and looked where she pointed. The words were plain enough to make me angry all over again. Perpetual ingress and egress. Unobstructed access. Recorded and binding. The strips are bad, she said. The lock change is worse. Removing or handling property after being told to stop is worse still. He keeps moving from arrogant to indefensible. That was the first moment all day I let myself feel something close to hope. Not relief. Relief comes later. Hope is sharper. Hope feels like the second before a dead battery turns over. Claire drafted a formal demand letter while I watched. Return possession immediately. Remove all obstructions from the easement. Cease interference with deeded property rights. Preserve all items removed from the premises. She attached copies of the deed, the survey, the easement, and stills from the trail camera. Then she emailed it to Grant, the HOA board address listed on the community website, and the association's management inbox, and she sent a hard copy by courier because, in her words, people love pretending they did not see email until a paper envelope lands on their desk. After that, she called the county code office and reported an unauthorized access obstruction installed on a recorded easement. I called my insurance company and documented potential property interference. Every step felt small by itself. Click send. Confirm parcel number. Read a timestamp aloud. Verify mailing address. But by 4:30 that afternoon, those small steps had formed a wall Grant could not charm his way through. Then my phone buzzed again. Another trail camera alert. I opened it and felt my pulse jump. Grant was standing on my porch, staring down at his phone, reading something. The color had gone out of his face even in the grainy image. He turned his head toward the driveway, toward those spike strips he had bolted down so proudly. And for the first time all day, he did not look like a man in control. He looked like a man doing math too late. By sunrise the next morning, the whole thing had started to feel less like a neighbor dispute and more like a slow mechanical failure that Grant could hear but could not stop. I drove back toward the lake with a legal pad on the passenger seat, my phone mounted on the dash, and every document Claire had prepared stacked in a neat folder beside me. The sky was pale silver over the water, and a low mist still hung over the shoreline, softening the boat docks and tree line in a way that would have been beautiful on any other day. But all I could think about was that black-painted door and the sound of Grant reading a demand letter he never expected to receive. When I turned onto the county road, I did not drive straight to the cabin. I parked half a mile away near the public launch and waited. Claire had told me not to give him an argument. Let the paper move first. Let the clock do what emotion could not. So I sat there with the window cracked, smelling lake water and wet pine, refreshing the trail camera feed every few minutes. At 7:12, Grant stepped onto my porch with no coffee mug this time. At 7:14, he crouched near the spike strips and touched one of the bolts without removing it, like a man checking whether his own mistake had somehow become less real overnight. At 7:20, a white SUV pulled up behind his truck. A woman got out carrying a leather binder and moved with the tight, irritated pace of somebody who had been forced into a problem before breakfast. Even through the grainy camera angle, I recognized the type immediately. Property manager. Board counsel. Somebody sent to clean up a mess after the person who caused it had already made everything worse. Grant started talking the second she stepped onto the gravel. His hands moved fast. Big gestures. Defensive posture. The woman barely reacted. She looked at the strips. She looked at the posted sign. She looked at the black door. Then she held out her hand, and Grant gave her his phone. She read something, handed it back, and pointed straight at the drive. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just direct. The kind of pointing people use when they realize the room for pretending is over. I took screenshots of everything. Every timestamp. Every movement. Every frame where Grant went from confident to cornered by inches. Then my own phone rang. Claire, County Code is sending an inspector this morning, she said. And the deputy who reviewed your file yesterday is meeting them there. Do not arrive before they do. I looked out through the windshield at the lake, flat and gray in the early light, and let that sink in. This was no longer me trying to convince people of what was obvious. This was process. Verified records. Logged evidence. Official eyes on a private fantasy that had finally run into public paperwork. Around 8:05, the trail camera caught a county truck pulling in. Then the deputy. Then, 20 minutes later, the camera angle shifted slightly as somebody must have brushed the pine branch, and for 1 second I got a cleaner view of the porch than I had seen yet. The cheap welcome mat was gone. So was the little decorative sign Grant had posted by the steps. He was already trying to unwind the scene, removing the costume pieces before they could be read back to him in a report. But that was the thing about panic. It always arrives after the evidence has already been made. He could take up a mat. He could pull down a sign. He could not unpaint the door before an inspector saw it. He could not unbolt the strips fast enough to erase the drill marks in the gravel. He could not put my father's mug back in the cabinet and pretend his fingerprints had never been there. I started the truck, finally, and headed toward the cabin with the folder under my arm and that same cold steadiness in my chest. The closer I got, the more the place looked like itself again, not because Grant had fixed anything, but because the lie was losing shape. A deputy's cruiser by the road does that. So does a county seal on a clipboard. By the time I rolled up to the edge of the drive, Grant Holloway was no longer standing on my porch like a king of anything. He was standing off to the side in loafers dusted white with gravel, watching another man photograph the strips he had installed, and for the first time since this started, he looked exactly what he was. Not powerful, not protected, just trespassing in daylight. The county inspector was a narrow man in a tan field jacket with a clipboard tucked against his chest, and the kind of expression that never changed unless a fact changed it first. He did not care about Grant's tone, or my family history, or the HOA logo on the side of the white SUV. He cared about measurements, filings, access language, and what was physically in front of him. That worked in my favor. I stood near the edge of the gravel while he crouched beside the spiked strips, ran a pen along the bolts, and looked back toward the road in one clean line that said more than any argument could. The deputy stayed close, hands resting light on his duty belt, watching everybody with that patient, unreadable calm law enforcement gets when they already know which direction the day is turning. Grant kept trying to talk ahead of the facts. This was a temporary safety solution, he said. The board had concerns about unauthorized use. The inspector did not even look up. Unauthorized by whom? He asked. Grant hesitated just long enough to matter. By non-residents, he said, and the moment he said it, the deputy glanced at me, then down at the deed packet in his hand, and I could almost hear the word collapse under its own stupidity. Non-resident. On my own property. The inspector stood, took the survey Claire had flagged for him, and walked the line himself. He checked the parcel markers. He checked the easement notes. He checked the county map copy against the physical approach. Then he turned to Grant and asked the one question that finally stripped the polish off everything. Who authorized installation on this recorded access? Grant tried to pivot to the board again, to maintenance, to neighborhood standards, to visual consistency. All those soft words people use when they are hoping vocabulary can do the heavy lifting that law will not. But the inspector did not let him float. Name, he said. Who approved it? Grant swallowed. The property manager in the white SUV stepped in then, binder open against her forearm, and for the first time she sounded less like a consultant and more like someone protecting herself from fallout. There is no county authorization on file, she said, and there is no board resolution in my packet extending governance to this parcel. That sentence hit like a door closing. Not loud. Final. Grant's face changed in a way I will probably remember for the rest of my life. Not because he looked scared exactly, more because he looked offended that reality had not been around him after all. He turned toward me, maybe expecting anger, maybe expecting some speech he could dismiss as emotional. I gave him nothing. I just handed the deputy the printed trail camera stills, each one time-stamped, each one showing him moving in and out of my cabin after being told to stop. The deputy studied the photos in silence, then passed them to the inspector, who laid them right on top of the deed packet as if they belonged there. In a way, they did. Proof of access. Proof of interference. Proof of possession without authority. The wind shifted off the lake and brought the smell of damp pine, old dock boards, and that lingering synthetic edge from the black paint on the front door. It mixed together in the morning air, wrong and familiar at the same time. I looked past Grant at the porch and thought about the pantry wall inside, about the little pencil marks still hidden behind the folding door, my father's handwriting beside each one. Age 10, age 11, age 12. He had written the dates so carefully, like even growth should have a record. Maybe that is why this mattered to me the way it did. Not because Grant made me angry, though he had. Not because the HOA overreached, though it did. But because some places are supposed to stay anchored to the people who built them, and the second somebody decides convenience matters more than truth, you either defend that anchor or you watch the whole thing drift. The inspector clipped his pen to the board, nodded once to the deputy, and said, "This obstruction needs to come out today." Then the deputy looked at Grant and added the line I had been waiting to hear. "Since the moment I saw sunlight hit those steel teeth in my driveway. And you are going to stop treating this parcel like it belongs to you." Grant did not argue right away after the deputy said it. That was the first sign the ground had really shifted under him. He just stood there beside the drive with a fine coat of white gravel dust on his loafers, blinking at the inspector, the deputy, the property manager, and me like one of us had broken the script. The lake breeze moved through the pine branches overhead, carrying that cool, resin smell that always reminded me of early mornings at the cabin before the sun burned the mist off the water. Usually that smell settled me. That day it made everything feel sharper. The inspector gave Grant a written notice regarding the obstruction and stepped back while the deputy explained, in the calmest voice possible, that the access needed to be cleared immediately and that any further interference with the parcel would only make his position worse. Grant looked at the property manager for backup. She did not give it to him. She had her binder open against her hip, lips pressed thin, and she looked less like an ally than a woman mentally calculating how far this mess was about to splash. "Remove them," she said. "No warmth. No performance. Just damage control." For a second Grant did not move. Then he crouched beside the spiked strips with the stiff, resentful posture of a man obeying the truth only because he had finally run out of room not to. He started backing the bolts out one by one while the inspector photographed the process and the deputy watched in silence. Every metallic turn of the wrench sounded clean in the morning air. Small hard clicks. The sound of bad ideas coming loose. I stood a few yards back with my folder tucked under one arm and let him work. I did not help. I did not speak. He had wanted the driveway to be a stage, and now it was, just not for the scene he planned. Once the strips were up, the inspector photographed the drill holes left behind in the gravel and made a note on his clipboard. Then the deputy asked for the cabin keys. That was the moment Grant finally cracked. "This is ridiculous," he said, voice rising just enough to show the strain underneath. There was an understanding. The deputy held out his hand and said, "No, there was a trespass issue and an access obstruction. Give me the keys." I watched Grant reach into his pocket, hesitate, then pull out a ring that did not belong to him. My keys were on there too, hanging from the old brass fish keychain my father bought at a bait shop when I was 14. Seeing that little brass fish flash in Grant Holloway's hand made my stomach tighten in a way I still cannot quite explain. It was such a small thing, but that is what theft always is in the end. Not grand, not cinematic, just somebody deciding your ordinary things are convenient enough to take. The deputy handed the ring to me without ceremony, and the metal felt warm from Grant's pocket. Warm and wrong. Then came the final turn. Claire pulled into the drive 10 minutes later, stepped out of her car, and walked straight over with a printed possession notice in one hand, and that same steady expression she had worn since this began. She spoke briefly with the deputy, then with the property manager, and by the time she turned back toward me, it was done. Grant was to remove his remaining personal items from the cabin immediately under observation. No board fiction, no more transition file nonsense, no annexation fantasy. Just a man being told to take his things and leave property he never had any right to control. He went inside with the deputy watching from the porch and came back out carrying 2 grocery bags, a folded jacket, and a cardboard file box that looked embarrassingly small compared to the arrogance he had dragged in with him the day before. The cheap plastic deck box under the side window was loaded into the back of his truck. The fake welcome mat disappeared next. Even the black trash bag full of whatever supplies he had used came out and got tossed into his bed. Piece by piece, the costume of ownership came off. The property manager did not say another word to him. She only watched, binder tucked tight against her side, like she wanted to leave before his choices became attached to her name any more than they already were. I walked up the steps only after the deputy nodded to me. The porch boards gave that familiar soft creak under my boots, and for the first time in 2 days, the cabin sounded like mine again. Not because everything was fixed. The black paint still scarred the door. The side bench was still missing. The air still held the stale edge of someone else's coffee and the wrong kind of detergent drifting out from inside. But the lie had been removed from it. That mattered. Behind me, Grant shut his truck door harder than he meant to and stood there for one last second with both hands on his hips, staring at the cabin like he still thought indignation counted as ownership. Then the deputy told him he needed to go, and finally, at 48 hours almost to the minute from the moment I first saw steel teeth across my drive, Grant Holloway got in his truck and left my property. I stood in the doorway after everyone left and just listened. No speeches, no victory lap, just the cabin settling around me the way an old place does when the wrong person is finally gone. The screen door gave its familiar soft rattle in the breeze. Somewhere out by the dock, a loose cleat tapped wood in a slow, uneven rhythm. The air inside carried layers I knew by heart beneath everything Grant had dragged in with him. Cedar, lake water, dust warmed by sunlight. The faint ghost of old coffee worked deep into the boards over years of early mornings. That was the first moment I let myself breathe all the way in. The black paint on the front door still looked wrong, like a bruise on a face you recognize instantly, but the house itself already felt less insulted. I set my folder down on the kitchen counter and looked around carefully, not rushing it, letting my eyes land on each thing he had touched and each thing that had survived him. The curtains over the sink were folded back the way my mother used to leave them when she wanted more light in the room. The iron skillet still hung on the wall hook beside the stove. On the pantry door frame, half hidden in shadow, were the pencil marks my father made every summer measuring my height. The dates written in his neat block letters, steady as fence posts. Age 10, age 11, age 12. I reached out and ran my thumb just beneath the marks without touching the graphite itself. Like even now I did not want to smudge his handwriting. Grant had changed the lock, painted the door, moved my things, and walked around this cabin like paperwork could make memory disposable. But he had not understood the simplest part. A place built by patient hands keeps a record longer than people think. It keeps it in scratches on the porch rail, in the groove beside the back hook where keys hit wood for 40 years, in the light stain on the floor near the window where my father always set his tackle box after sunrise. You can fake authority for a day or two. You cannot fake history. I stepped back outside and looked down at the gravel drive, at the pale scars where the bolts had been pulled from the spike strips. The inspector had marked them. The deputy had photographed them. Claire had copies of everything. Those little holes in the gravel were all that remained of Grant's version of power, and even they would be gone after one good rain and a fresh rake. I bent down near the edge of the drive and found what I had noticed earlier, half buried in the stone. One loose steel spike, no longer attached to anything, dull on one side where it had scraped rock. I picked it up and turned it in my fingers. Such a small piece of metal. Such a stupid choice. That was the thing that stayed with me most when the adrenaline wore off. Not the black door. Not the fake notice. Not even seeing my father's mug in another man's hand. It was the absurd arrogance of believing you could block a deeded easement with hardware store steel and neighborhood confidence and somehow come out the rightful owner. I carried the spike inside, set it on the kitchen table beside the chipped mug after washing the mug clean, and stood there for a second looking at both of them in the late afternoon light. One object from my father. One object from Grant's mistake. That was the whole story in a single frame. Outside, the lake flashed silver through the trees, and the cabin windows caught the light the way they always had around that hour, soft and low and honest. I pulled my keys from my pocket, took the brass fish keychain off the ring, and hung it back on the hook by the back door where it belonged. Then I called a locksmith to replace everything that had been changed, and after that I opened every window in the cabin to let the clean pine air move through from front to back. It pushed out the stale smell of someone else's detergent, someone else's coffee, someone else's certainty. By dusk, the place felt like itself again. Not repaired all at once. Not restored by magic. Just reclaimed, which is better, because reclaimed means the truth held. When I locked the door that night, it was with my own key, on my own porch, under a sky turning blue over the lake, and I realized something almost funny. Grant thought power meant standing on my steps and telling me I did not belong there. He thought ownership was whatever he could announce loudly enough in a pullover with an HOA board behind him. But in the end, all his authority fit into 2 grocery bags, a cheap plastic deck box, and one long embarrassed drive out of a place he never should have touched. I looked once more at the steel spike on the table before turning out the kitchen light, and I left it there on purpose. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Because justice is not loud. It is patient, documented, and inevitable.